The following featured presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. Before we get to our guests for this episode, we're excited to announce that we're going to be hosting 2 panels at Star Wars Celebration. Stay tuned until the end of this episode for more details. I'm your co-host, Melissa Miller. I'm the science and technology writer for Nerdist.
And I'm your co-host, James Floyd. I write for Star Wars Insider Magazine and StarWars.com as a freelancer. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about economics. Yes, we're finally getting to the episode where we talk about the taxation of trade routes and outlying systems. Our guest experts today are Molly Maloney and Alex Parret, who are economists. Alex has a PhD in economics and works at Google, and Molly will start at the Brattle Group after completing her PhD this summer at the University of California at Irvine. Welcome, Alex and Molly.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. It's great to be here.
So great to have you. I'm excited to finally get to this episode we've been hyping for the entire run of our show so far. Can you quickly define what is economics and tell us a little bit more about your expertise?
Well, this is one of our favorite arguments, actually. I would define economics as the study of scarcity and how people sort of respond to that scarcity in terms of resources, incentives and behavior and decision making.
And I always like to joke that economics is the study of everything because you can really cast almost every problem that we face in day-to-day life in an economics context.
Just like physics.
Exactly. And economists like to pretend that
we like to be experts in everything.
We like to pretend that we're physicists sometimes. So there's some parallels there.
So what are your individual specialties in economics?
Sure. I like to study economics of gender and economics of discrimination. So sort of a more niche area.
Yeah, so I'm an economist by training, but I didn't spend much time doing traditional economics. Most of my work has been on the measurement side. So it's mostly statistics, but for economics problems. So most of my work is usually answering questions like, well, if something changes, how do we measure why that thing changed? Doing that in as flexible of an approach as possible, minimizing kind of the assumptions that we place on the models.
Is that econometrics or is that something completely
different? It is
different?
econometrics, yeah. I try not to use the term too much because people are like, oh, what's that? But yes, my specialty is in econometrics.
Nice. Yeah, we definitely have some jargon on the show, just as long as you explain what it is.
Awesome.
Did Star Wars influence your career paths at all?
Well, I'm a later to the game fan, so not for me specifically. Alex, did it for you?
Yeah, I don't think it did. I mean, I definitely have spent a good chunk of my life with Star Wars, starting as a very, very young child, watching the original trilogy over and over and over again, and actually listening to the now Legacies audiobooks was a big part of my childhood. Heir to the Empire was a fan favorite, definitely.
Oh, yeah. I read that so many times, and it's so much fun still.
I was just going to say, I think it's fairly separate in terms of my academic pursuits and my love of Star Wars.
But now looking back on it as economists, do you pick up on all sorts of things? Are you able to enjoy it for what it is, or do you nitpick little bits of it?
Well, I think especially in preparing for this, we were thinking about it a little bit more, but probably some things stick out more than others in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think watching it, like as a kid, obviously I was not in tune to as much detail as there was in terms of the economic motivations for almost all of the storylines. But yeah, looking back, kind of looking at particularly the prequel trilogy where they really flushed some of this out. It's very cool how much time they spent thinking about it.
So back in the original trilogy days, you weren't thinking about how much profit and overhead does it take for the Jawas to, get along? Is driving across the desert looking for droids really that great of a business model?
No, I don't think so. It was more like, oh yeah, I get to see R2 zap one.
Yeah, now that you mention it, the economics just on Tatooine could probably be an episode in terms of, there's slavery there. That's obviously a consideration. Moisture farming, are these subsistence or is this actually making money? Now I've got all sorts of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of payoffs going on.
Yeah, especially with all the gambling going on there and all the crime.
That's right.
Now the big question, taxation of trade routes. How might you tax trade routes?
Well, I mean, I think when they talk about taxing trade routes, I always thought that the phrasing seems sort of odd because it seems to me the most obvious place to tax would be, in a port or, at the end point. So I guess, yeah, the idea of taxing, if that's that literal interpretation is a little bit trickier.
I don't know. I think one of the big problems with Star Wars and taxation is enforcement, right? Like in the inner rim worlds, it seems like it's a lot easier to enforce things. You're close to Coruscant. You can actually collect these taxes. Everyone's doing well, but then you start getting further and further out. And the cost of enforcement becomes pretty astronomical if you think about it. So I'm not really sure what the benefits are at a certain point. Once you get far enough out, these poorer worlds like Tatooine, for example, would it be worth taxing these guys? It also depends on what point in time we're talking about. Obviously, if we're talking about the prequel timelines, then that's not even part of the Republic. But maybe in the newer periods, does the Empire even care about Tatooine? Probably not.
Yeah, I'm thinking with the Trade Federation, the Republic might just say, hey, you're using this trade route. You got to give us so much money to keep a monopoly on that. If you want to control the trade to Naboo from these other places, you got to pay the Republic so much to keep your monopoly on that. And that kind of makes it really tough for, planets like Naboo that don't get a say.
We're looking into the origins of the Trade Federation as like a means to establish free trade routes originally, which is kind of like a natural monopoly, right? Like the government, in this case, the Republic, is giving these guys access to the trade routes and saying, hey, open these up, enforce these, make sure that they're open lanes for trade. But then all of a sudden, the Trade Federation, as you might expect sometimes a monopolist to do, will take advantage of that situation. And that's kind of where things go south. They start trying to take some of the profit away from the lanes. They start imposing their own taxation, which was never the intent, right? But then, of course, you have the Sith pulling the strings, so it's kind of hard to disentangle the political machinations from the economics there. But yeah, it's quite fascinating what would have happened in the absence of, say, like a Sidious character putting that pressure on the Trade Federation. Would it have still been optimal for them to do what they did? Or would it have been the best strategy for them to just say, okay, here, take some of our profits. We're still going to make a lot of money at the end of the day.
But on the other hand, it's not, I mean, you kind of said this, but it's not really practical to imagine a government enforcing trade routes so far out anyhow. Yeah. So, it's to some extent a plausible solution to sort of delegate that to a private entity.
I guess we'd have to pull up our galactic star chart. I don't actually remember how far away Naboo is from Coruscant, but yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. Are there real world examples that sort of fit here?
Thing that comes to mind for me is our privatized freeways and tolls. Governments don't have to build them. Private entities gets to tax the people who drive on them. It's not a direct trade issue, but part of the infrastructure we create is to allow for commerce to exist. So in a sort of an indirect sense.
It's basically privatizing a public function, perhaps. And then, we kind of have that back in the British Empire and the kind of the mercantilism where basically the East Indian Trading Company privatized the trade network that fed all the money back to England and obviously had a lot of political clout. The Trade Federation seems to have the same thing. They have a Senate seat. So like, how does that work when a corporate interest has direct political power?
Well, we kind of have that now, right? With lobbies.
But indirectly.
But it's indirect, yeah. So direct, that's interesting. Like, do we have any examples of a corporation having a vote?
Although, is it the question I have is how advantageous is it to have a direct? Like, I think if you asked Facebook if they wanted to be responsible and vote in the Senate, I think they would say no. For example, or, when I think about the big giants today, I think there's some advantages to having indirect power. So it is interesting because, I think a lot of times you want to be influencing without the responsibility.
Right. Maybe they wouldn't have raised so many red flags if they had just sort of worked a little bit more subtly in the system or something.
Just using all that dark money.
Yeah.
Which sort of brings up this other question we sort of talked about is what's not clear to me in the movies, and maybe you have more background in the books, is like how media is working, like in terms of dissemination of information, because
like the HoloNet, how much of it is censored and how much of it is controlled by, which time period, right?
Well, definitely under the Empire had a pretty strict authoritarian control over the media. But that is something that we don't see much in the original trilogy, is the role of the media in the war. And I think part of that is just kind of a relic of its time period, that that the rise of cable, 24-hour cable news after the release of Star Wars and just being an omnipresent factor really kind of came after. And that's why we now have the HoloNet and the HoloNet news networks that send out information, share news. But what is the role of the media in the economy?
Well, there's lots of ways to answer that question. I think, there's obviously a direct sense in which the media is, selling ads and that sort of sense. But I also think it's a big way in which we monitor the rest of the economy and the political factors that are at play is through, it's a form of oversight, I would say, which is sort of what I was getting at when you're thinking of the benefits of indirect or direct power. I think part of that trade-off is incumbent upon, having someone sort of that information getting out of who's voting and how that's perceived by the population at large. That's where I was thinking about that question.
I don't think either of us are game theorists, but information asymmetry is definitely a huge issue that you could have in kind of the imperial side of things, where obviously the empire knows exactly what's going on, at least certain people in the empire, whereas the citizens have very little idea of the actual events that are going on. So you can tell one story to get a different outcome solely based through this asymmetry of the information. The individuals don't know what the empire does.
On episode 8 of our podcast, we talked to a historian and a journalist a little bit about these issues, but we didn't really get into the, political voting record accountability conversation. So this is really interesting for it to come up again with economics. I feel like while we're on the topic of the prequels, maybe we should just dive right into can you build a secret clone army over the course of decades? ? It was at least years. In the sequels, then that leads into like the huge, first order fleet too. Like there's a money trail, yes, for these things.
I think it kind of does get into that question of how, when you're dealing with such a vast empire or republic, depending on the era, it's a lot of space to be monitoring. And I think in some of these cases, there's private entities are sort of funneling the money through. So like how closely can you monitor when you have such a wide domain to be responsible for? It doesn't seem implausible to me that could go under the radar.
Yeah. And I think it depends what you treat as canon now, but I remember when I read this book like 10 years ago, whatever, the Darth Plagueis book talked a lot about kind of how all these machinations came to be. And it's not really surprising that when one individual is pulling all the strings through various means, that they can hide a lot of things, especially when you have the Jedi Order involved. Like, I don't think the Republic didn't have much oversight onto what the Jedi were doing. In a lot of ways, I guess you could think about it as like the central bank, like the federal government has very little oversight into what the central bank can do. So I guess the Jedi are like a central bank type entity.
Wait, does that make the Jedi Council the Federal Reserve Board?
Obviously not, but it's kind of a nice parallel in that like these are two entities that are both serving the public good in a certain way, but they don't actually check each other than through, in our case, through the economy. Actually working the way we want it to. In the Republican Jedi case, I guess it's the societal well-being. Of course, that didn't work out so well there. So hopefully hopefully we don't have any kind of parallels other than the oversight. But I don't see why it would be hard, at least for the clone army part, as far as like they were so far away.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about because I mean, I don't watch Attack of the Clones super often, I'll be honest. But whenever I do, I'm like, wait, he's both the Darth Sidious, Chancellor Palpatine, orchestrating both of these huge, the clone army, the droid army. But what you say makes sense. I just never thought about it before, that it's actually easier if he's sort of in charge of both of those things. So that's interesting that that's actually potentially, maybe not on that scale, but potentially realistic.
But also, what an expensive scheme.
Yes.
Well, the Sith have been working at this for millennia. So there's this thing I think you guys know about. It's called compound interest. So they've got money.
Yeah,
fair,
they certainly do.
This was always a thing, though, when I was watching old James Bond movies, or it came up again, obviously, in Austin Powers, is you have these huge, secret layers or missiles or whatever, and lots of people have to build these things. Lots of people have to get paid, right? There's payroll. There's, lunch services. There's just all of these little things would be noticeable, especially for, Dr. No out in the middle of the desert or whatever. Like all of these workers have to live somewhere. So the economics of all of that level of stuff seems like summone would have noticed.
It's hard because we don't see any, like in the US, we have organizations specifically created to sort of be sussing out these sort of security threats. And you don't really see that. I think you're right. It just, I think like the enforcement bodies aren't super clear to me.
And also you have a planet that's solely designed to clone people or clone creatures, basically, right? Their economy, from what we see, it's like a closed economy other than transactions to generate these clones. So from that perspective, it's like one check that goes to these guys and they just do it. They do everything that they're normally doing. And the Republic is not saying, hey, you guys are allowed to clone these guys. You're not allowed to clone those guys. I don't even know if they're part of the Republic at that point. I mean, I assume they're not, but I don't know.
Aren't, but then during the Clone Wars, they come and they have a senator named Halle Bertoni.
These are also James Bond names. I just have to point that out since we were talking about James Bond a minute ago.
Yeah.
I certainly want to talk about currency because I've been thinking about it a lot recently with Book of Boba Fett and all the payoffs, like you said, helmets full of coins and stuff. But I also want to understand, I mean, I know that linguistics don't study spelling, right? Do economists actually study and work with currency, right? Is this an economist's field?
So there are definitely economists who pay attention to currency. We're probably not in that category.
But I think it's also fair to say that, I guess I shouldn't say most, but many macroeconomists would say that money is hard to explain.
Yes. Yeah.
So the existence of money doesn't enter into most of the models that we use. It's much more abstract in those cases. So
yeah, we like to talk about things in what we call real terms.
Money, obviously has lots of different meanings. That there's the actual currency. There is money that's basically just value in banks and financial instruments that doesn't relate to actual currency. It's just kind of passed around and that becomes the money supply. Looking at the values that we do see mentioned, they're pretty scant on when they mention actual kind of credit amounts. But, when they do you think that it all relatively makes sense? Like, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable price for that.
I think it's a little bit hard to judge because, right, it's all coming down to what there is in abundance and what there is in scarcity. And so as not maybe as meticulous a viewer as some others, it's not always obvious to me, like what materials are really abundant on a planet, how much labor, what their labor force is looking like. And so, to compare the price of one thing to another, it's not always clear to me.
One thing about the value of a dollar in, say, Venezuela versus the value of a dollar in San Francisco, like the actual value.
You mean like what it's getting you?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
As a unit of exchange for some good. I guess the example of Luke's speeder bike selling for X number of credits. One of the big issues in Star Wars to me is always, what is the actual unit of currency? Is it imperial credit or is it something else? Because we see early on, like Tatooine doesn't accept Republic credits. So why would they accept imperial credits? It seems kind of weird. So maybe there's a different type of credit they're referring to. But at the same time,
But that can also change over time, right? Like the value of a certain currency, we know people are more or less willing to accept it when they have more or less trust in the government that insures it.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about them not accepting Republic credits, because then in The Mandalorian, right, they don't accept Imperial credits. And that seems interesting because, like, does that mean they're made out of something different? Is it just the stamp on it? Is it like what you were talking about, the government that backs it up? Obviously, that government doesn't exist anymore. There's a devaluation there.
Now it makes me wonder if there's inflation in Star Wars.
Very timely topic, yes.
Well, you would certainly think there would be, right? If the Empire is actually paying a huge portion of their labor force, which it's not really clear that they are, but suppose they were, and they're constantly building and building and building, it would seem logical for them to be devaluing their currency. We don't really see evidence of wages or exchanges. I can't even think of an example in the literature where that pops up.
Do we know what the imperial credits are made of? Are they a fiat money or?
I believe so.
Can you explain currency devaluation and fiat money for us really quick?
So fiat money in general is, well, like the US dollar, it has no intrinsic value by itself. It's just a piece of paper, right? But it's backed by a guarantee by the United States government that says this is worth $1, which...
But there's no gold standard anymore, right? You're not trading that in for a good. A common example of a currency with intrinsic value would be like prison cigarettes used as currency, right? You could use them to trade, but also if you want to smoke them, they have a purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we all agree together as a society that this $1 bill is worth $1. And we agree on that because the United States government tells us this is worth $1, right? So it's a bit of a confusing concept. And again, why it doesn't show up in economic models, because we usually like to think of money as something with intrinsic value. But that's kind of the gist of it. And I think the question was, do we see imperial credits as anything other than fiat money? I don't know of an example where we see imperial credits, but I think in like video games and stuff, you see cards, right? I think.
Okay. They're not made out of Beskar.
Definitely not made out of Beskar.
They'd be like, I'm going to take all this money and make some armor.
Yeah. Well, we see that with pennies, right? I think pennies, if you melted them down, are worth more than.
Yeah, if you want to commit the felony, you can do that.
Hey, copper is, a hot commodity these days.
It's true.
Yeah, and so then going back to kind of inflation and money devaluation, if the empire were paying everybody wages and these wages were fixed, say like for whatever reason they were paying Death Star techs $100 an hour or 100 imperial credits an hour, and all of a sudden here comes the rebellion. The first Death Star is destroyed. We are building a second Death Star. We're crunched for raw materials. We just start creating imperial credits. Now we keep the wages at 100 imperial credits an hour for all these Death Star techs, but the real value of that imperial credit is going down because I'm creating more and more imperial credits.
It's going to buy you less.
Yeah. So that would be like one of the classic ways of devaluing your currency in a situation where the government is stretched for funds.
I don't know. It just seems like in an economy that big, would it really devalue that much?
Well, I mean, think about you could create arbitrarily many credits, right? So if this happens a lot you see this in Argentina, you've seen this historically in places like Zimbabwe, the central banks there, which are usually part of the fiscal policy side, so kind of the elected officials, they'll want to push some agenda. And so they'll tell the central bank, print, and they'll print billions and billions of whatever their unit of currency is. And all of a sudden, something that costs $1 Argentinian dollar will cost 100. Now, the person on the street that's making money, their wages are sticky. They're not going to change overnight. So their employer is still paying them $10 an hour or whatever. But now the real value of their dollar has gone down 10x. So it's actually a pretty easy mechanism for the empire in this case to do that will have an immediate effect.
It's not a good long-term strategy.
No, it's a terrible long-term strategy, right? But here they don't care.
Not recommending it.
Here they really don't care because it's so different. Yeah. And obviously the emperor doesn't care about money.
Maybe that is why they don't accept.
That's another reason not to accept imperial credits.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if this topic gets too political, but I am curious about economics of war. You know, we were talking about in Star Wars, right? Like every trilogy is based around conflict. And as you said, it's not necessarily logical to operate this way. So what economic value is there in starting, finishing, you know, having these sort of huge epic wars?
Yeah, that's tricky because the empire's motivations are not financial. Like it's very clear that the emperor wants to control everything. It's not really clear why, other than he's a Sith and he's entitled to, but there's limited financial motivations. In general, like if you can take all of the profit away, like if you think about it from a welfare perspective, all of the citizens of the empire, if you can squeeze all the consumer surplus from them, you take all the wealth for yourselves. In this case, the emperor and I don't know, his moths and grand admirals maybe, but I don't know. That doesn't seem to be the motivation for most of the empire's actions.
Yeah, they didn't really show a lot of them like off living the high life or anything like that. So.
And I think a big part of when you think about World War II, right, it was great for the US economy, but partly because you get everyone employed and you're spending all this money on these big endeavors, but the fighting's not happening here. So you're not seeing the destruction of war that can be catastrophic for the economy. You know, I think there's a paper out about the devastation that would have occurred to the galactic economy with the destruction of the Death Star. So, you know, you have to think about both sides of that, I would say.
There's a paper out about that?
Yeah, we're going to need to see that.
Estimating the economic loss there.
Wow.
That's great. We'll link to that in our show notes. I love that people, you know, do these thought experiments. Molly, when you mentioned your specialty being gender economics and economics of discrimination, other than what we've already talked about here, how that applies to Star Wars, because it seems like a really fascinating specialty.
Yeah. So I think one of the, most clear examples that comes to my mind is I think it's episode 1 of Mandalorian. He has to pay more because he refuses the droid driver and he gets a clunker with a non-droid driver because in the beginning, right, he doesn't like droids. But that's a classic, issue with discrimination, right? If you are only going to interact with some people, you might have to pay more for that, for lack of a better word, preference, and there's also inefficiencies that come out of that. So I like that example of this sort of, you're kind of only punishing yourself with that mentality.
Is that really the bottom line here on Earth? That logically, more than philosophically and all of those other things that, economically, logically.
There's better reasons to not be okay.
Right.
Yeah, right. There's plenty of other reasons to not be discriminatory, but I like when you see examples where it's also costly.
Yeah, that's pretty decent literature on the costs of discrimination, right? More so than the societal costs, I think, the individual costs.
Yeah.
Monetary costs.
I guess there's less of an economic cost, like when they don't allow the droids into the cantina, right? But
that's true.
Presumably, I don't know how much they drink.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing is they take up space and they don't drink.
Yeah.
No, I like the idea that they, there might be like oil or something there that they would consume and they're losing out on that market. So never thought about that before.
I don't know. In the Freemaker Adventures, Roger, the battle droid, is always saying, hey, 30 weight, that's the good stuff.
There you go. Someone else had this idea. I love it. Well, are there other examples in Star Wars that you can think of, or that when you watch the movies or read the books, you really think of like, oh, I know maybe too much about that topic?
When we were talking about the hiding of the clone army or those things, what always strikes me is I want to know who's funding the Rebel Alliance and like how their money is not affected when obviously Leia's family had money, but like the planet blew up. Where were her assets being stored if she still has access to all that cash? So that's always sticks out to me as kind of confusing.
You're princess of what now?
Yeah,
where sweet asteroid
all your money off-world? I don't know.
Yeah, it's like I hope her, assets weren't in real estate.
Right.
Yeah, of all of the times
Yeah,
we've thought
we were
about dark
talking about
stuff at Alderaan exploding, I hadn't never thought about, all of her money in the bank somewhere. Interesting.
Ben is so confident he can pay Han Solo, and they do. They're like, "Here's your money." They have it somehow still, so I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it was all she was just carrying it around.
Yeah, she's just her. I mean, there's not a lot of room though in those outfits they put her in. Like, yeah, maybe it's in her hair.
Inside the bun, there's like coils of cyber currency.
Interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that, but you're right. When Han's walking off, right, with those like ammo boxes or something like that of credits.
Yeah, he's being paid in hard cash, which is probably what you want from a rebel group that is like, oh yeah, they could wire transfer you some money and then you find your bank account frozen because the Empire found that.
Well, are there any other topics that we should make sure we get to that you are excited to talk about?
We talked about principal agent problem.
We did.
Yeah. One of the things you study early, like one of the first things you learn in economics is the idea that employees might have different incentives than their bosses. And that's something to consider about how to align those incentives or what might go wrong if you don't. And there's a couple good examples, like when Jabba sends Greedo after Han, and, Greedo offers to forget he saw him if Han pays the debt to him instead of Jabba, or
what was the other one?
From Rogue One.
Galen Urso, when they force him to create the super laser, obviously he puts the flaw in the Death Star that allows them to destroy it. So that didn't really work out for them either.
Basically, like the free perks of having soda in the fridge, that doesn't always be the right motivator for your employees.
Exactly.
That, they might want to subvert you, or they might just want to go make their own money. And you can kind of also see that maybe not on an economic level, but on a political level, when Vader offers to Luke to, join me and we can rule, his father and son, the Emperor would be like, no, wait, that wasn't part of it. I didn't hire you to do that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, and you were talking about Vader's poor management skills,
That's a different type of motivation.
Yeah. I think that's come up in a couple of the books, at least the revamp of the canon, is how Vader decimated most of the upper tier admiralty and captaincy and left the Empire with a bunch of dunces, basically, which, that's... I don't know how much economics is there, but yeah, I mean, it incentivizes you to stay under the radar and not get noticed, because the second you get promoted, you get force choked because probably Vader made a bad decision.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite moments, Vader, kills one of the guys giving him bad news via hologram, I think. And the second in command is standing there and just sort of like steps over his dead body and like takes over, like, okay, I guess I'm in charge now. Congrats on my promotion. And just the look on this guy's face is it's classic. But yeah, you're right. Not a great incentive program.
Yeah, it's kind of a different form of failing upwards.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yes.
Well, how would one go about getting into different fields of economics? What would be the career path for someone wanting to do that?
So the first step is to take a lot of math classes, for better or for worse. That's sort of the prereq. If you want to go into like a graduate program, there's economists, though, I would say at a lot of different levels of education. So, there are economists. I had a friend go work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics right out of undergrad. So you certainly can work in the field right out of undergrad. But if you were interested in like pursuing grad school, I think the biggest thing is taking a lot of math. And I would say that's the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, now after undergrad, there's a lot of great what are called pre-doc programs that have cropped up to match the US system with the way Europe does things. In Europe, they kind of specialize a little bit earlier on. They start master's programs and then they matriculate to PhDs. In the US, because we have kind of this gap in education between undergrad and the PhD program, they've created these pre-doc programs. So if you're, I don't know, like a sophomore, junior in college, and you're thinking about this, it's probably worth exploring what pre-docs are available. And the biggest thing I would say is, if you're really interested in this in college, is go talk to the professors. They're going to know people and how to get you on the right path, because it's a hard thing to do, to break into, at least for grad.
Well, it's just that economics is a field where undergrad economics looks really, really different from grad school economics. And so it's just sort of a weird thing. Whereas I know I'm sure there's other fields where that's also true, but it's not true in every field. And so I think I had no idea what it would look like. Coming straight from undergrad to grad school is definitely a big change. So I think that's the thing that's not always obvious when you're looking into it.
No, that's really good advice, I think in general, but also good to know which fields are like that too, in terms of, if you're in a math class in undergrad, how many hundreds of people are in that class and planning for different tracks. And so to set yourself apart by, creating a relationship with the professor makes a lot of sense. Well, a new question for the podcast is, I would love to know what your favorite Star Wars characters are and why.
What is yours?
I really like R2-D2. I think he's a homie. He's always doing what he's supposed to do and not letting anyone get in his way, especially C-3PO.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with my, I'll preface this by saying when I was a kid, my favorite was Obi-Wan Kenobi. And that was primarily because my grandmother's favorite was Obi-Wan Kenobi. And, it was like our thing. But then growing up, I became a Darth Vader fan. I think it's a little bit of a weird one in that he's the bad guy, but he's also the hero of the story. He does save everyone at the end there. So it's kind of an interesting choice, but I always love the scenes. Well, that Rogue One scene where it's like all dark and all of a sudden the saber goes out. It's just very exhilarating. So
Alex also loves anyone in a cape. So I do
like the black cape.
Well, it works for Obi-Wan too, really, with those robes. It's cape-esque, so I can see it.
When I was a kid, I was running around in capes a lot.
Amazing. Well, Molly had the right answer. I mean, it's an opinion, but R2-D2 is in fact the right answer, aka my choice. James, since we've all given our choices, would you like to share yours too?
I'm going to go with Chewbacca. Chewbacca is, an all-around great guy that he's always there, has your back, provides a little bit of your conscience as well. Who wouldn't want a big Wookiee at your side? That you go in some place with a big Wookiee at your side, they're not going to give you trouble.
I like it. I also like that 3 out of 4 of us chose non-verbal, at least non-translated into English, right? Like I love R2-D2 because he's clearly a SAS droid. And Chewbacca, we think we know what he's saying just out of context, but I like that there's that ambiguity.
Well, where can people find you on social media? Do you guys have any upcoming publications? Anything we should know on what's going on in your world that you want to share?
I have a Twitter. I don't have very many followers, but I'm at Maloney314. I had to look it up because I don't actually know my handle. That tells you how many followers I have.
Is it a pie reference, I assume?
That's just what they gave me, but I should start saying that.
So I don't have anything super exciting. I'm just going to be grinding away at work. But if people are interested in reaching out, my Twitter handle is ADParret, Parret. Happy to chat with people if they want to DM me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex and Molly, for being here. This was a really great discussion, and we got into a whole lot more examples of economics in Star Wars than I was even thinking of.
Thanks so much for having us. This was really fun.
Yep. Thank you for being here. This was a lot of fun. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guests, Andrew Parret and Molly Maloney, and we want to thank all of you for listening. We also want to thank Catherine Maloney for nominating our guests today.
Okay, now let's talk about our panels at Star Wars Celebration Anaheim coming up at the end of May.
We've got 2 Star Warsologies panels at Celebration. The first one is The Science of Attack of the Clones. It's happening Saturday, May 28th from 11 a.m. to noon at the University Stage. Here's our description. From clone troopers to planetary rings to Anakin's moral struggles, Attack of the Clones is full of connections to real-world science. How might seismic charges work? Can you really accelerate clone growth? What is an all-ocean planet like Kamino really like? How healthy are Anakin and Padme's relationship? We have a bunch of great experts. Fawn Davis, the prequel model maker, will be joining us, as well as Dr. Drea Letamendi, a psychologist, Dr. Jim Lehane, our resident friend geologist, Dr. Lisa Will, astrophysicist, and J. Diane Dotson, who is a sci-fi author and biologist. Join us in celebrating the 20th anniversary of Episode 2 with a look into its science and technology, hosted by me.
Next up, the panel is called Galactic Critters Big and Small, and it will be Sunday, May 29th at 2 p.m., also on the university stage. Hosted by me. It's about wildlife in Star Wars, my favorite topic. Creatures big and small capture our attention and leave us curious to know more. I'm going to edit together clips of these wonderful critters, and they'll be narrated in the style of a nature documentary. I'm bringing together a panel of experts, including herpetologists, that's the study of reptiles and amphibians, Frank Santana, molecular biology, that's the study of cells, Michelle Nolasco, an ophthalmologist, eye specialist, Amit Patel, and paleoecologist, Jim Lehane, to talk about prehistoric life. We'll also have conservation biologist Samantha Wins to share how to help animals threatened by technology, invasive species, and even galactic war.
While Star Warsologies is presenting those two panels, I'm also doing a third panel. It's called Star Wars Tourism, Visiting the Galaxy Far, Far Away on Earth. It will be Friday the 27th from 2 to 3 p.m. at the university stage. From the deserts of Tunisia and California to the glaciers of Norway and the palaces of Italy, Star Wars filming sites are on everyone's travel bucket list. Our team of experts, led by me, will help you learn about where to go, how to get there, and how to get the most out of it with your fellow Star Wars fans. Whether you want to trek to remote places like Skellig Michael in Ireland or visit places in our own California backyard, we've got the info and tips for you. Rounding out our crew of tourism specialists are Sander DeLange, who writes for Star Wars Insider Magazine and TK421, Charla Teeter-Stewart, the Imperial County Film Commissioner, and Richard and Sarah Woloski, who you know from the Skywalking Through Neverland podcast.
Richard Woloski also wrote a book, and it's now available for pre-order. It's going to be ready for shipping or pickup at Star Wars Celebration Eve on May 25th. This is at the big Boonta Eve Cantina Bash and book launch. That's going to be at Big's Bar in Fullerton, California, the night before celebration. It's going to be a free event from 4 p.m. till midnight, an evening of podcasting, singing, celebrity signings, and the Today in Star Wars History book launch. And also live podcasting from Richard and Sarah from the Skywalking Network. Check out the Facebook event for details on the Skywalking Through Neverland page.
Sarah and Richard are also hosting two more panels that we'd like to tell you about, celebrating the Ewok adventures with Eric Walker and Kevin Thompson, and Fandom Through the Generations with guests Craig Miller and Dan Madsen, and maybe a surprise guest or two.
Skywalking Network will also be on the podcast stage. Come join us for a variety show, and we're going to give each of the Skywalking Network podcasts and hosts a chance to be in the spotlight. So James and I will be there, Skywalking Through Neverland and the rest of the network. That's going to be Friday, May 27th at 5 p.m.
Yep, come ask us anything.
Wow, James, we're going to be so busy. We hope to see you all there.
Meanwhile, if you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's Star Wars OLOGIES at gmail.com. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service.
And we'll have to come up with a new ending catchphrase, because no topic is off limits. Even the taxation of trade routes and outlying systems doesn't really work anymore. So let us know on social media if you have a new suggestion. We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including classic Marvel Star Wars comics, the Neverland Clubhouse, Resilient Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. You can find all of these shows at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.